I don't think it matters where we look in the epistle to the Hebrews, but Jesus Christ is presented, and rightly so, as being superior to everything that had gone before him. He was better than the angels, as we have seen this morning. He was better than Moses, than Joshua, and than Aaron. He was superior to the law, and the tabernacle which Moses built was inferior. The sacrifices that were offered had to be repeated year after year, day after day, and demonstrating that they could never take away sin. And the covenant which was made with Israel at Sinai, that too was inferior. Everything that we see in the book of Hebrews shows the superiority of the Lord Jesus Christ. And even in chapter 7 and verse 7, we're told that Melchizedek was better. And without all contradiction, the less is blessed of the better. And Abraham's greatness pales into insignificance before Melchizedek. And that must have been a challenge to the Jews. You remember when Jesus said to them, know the truth, in John chapter 8, know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. And quite instantly they responded by saying, we be Abraham's seed, and we're never in bondage to anybody. And so they revered Abraham. And even at the baptism of John the Baptist, you recall in Matthew chapter 3, John says to the Jewish leaders, think not that you have Abraham to your father. God is able of these stones to raise up children to Abraham. And so it must have been rather a blow when the apostle, writing to the Hebrews, demonstrates in this chapter the superiority of Melchizedek over Abraham. Verse 4 of Hebrews 7 says, now consider how great this man was, unto whom even the patriarch Abraham gave the 10th of the spoils. And you remember, under the law, the Levitical tribe had no inheritance in the land. God was their inheritance, so how are they going to sustain themselves? And it was decreed by God that Israel had to provide 1/10 of everything that they produced and give it to the priests. But you see, that supported the Levitical tribe throughout their generations. However, under the law, the Levites themselves had to give back 1/10 of that as a heave offering to God. And so they were required by God to give back what they'd received. Now, just go with me to Numbers chapter 18. And we pick up some of the thoughts in that particular chapter. Numbers 18, verse 26. Thus speak unto the Levites, and saying to them, when ye take of the children of Israel the tithes which I have given you from them for your inheritance, then ye shall offer up an heave offering of it for Yahweh, even 1/10 of the tithe. And so they had to give back this 1/10. And the word in verse 29, it says there that it had to be the best. Out of all your gifts, ye shall offer a heave offering of Yahweh, of all the best thereof, even the hallowed part thereof out of it. And so they had to give the very best. And that's the word Caleb. And you might have come across that because when Israel were asked to give a burnt offering, a sin offering, whatever kind it was, the fat, the Caleb, had to be placed upon the altar. All the fat is Yahweh's, says Leviticus chapter 3. And so it was the very best. God was given the very best. And in this case, it was the same. They had to give to God the very best of what they had. And notice in verse 28, it had to be given to the high priest. Now, when we think about that, they did it by commandment, whereas in the case of Abraham, it was a voluntary gift that Abraham offered to Melchizedek. Melchizedek didn't ask for a tenth of the spoils. Abraham volunteered it. And it says in chapter 7 and verse 4 that even Abraham gave the tenth of the spoils. And that word spoils, it's the Greek word akrothenion, and it means the best of the crop. And so Abraham, whatever he gathered as a result of that victory, he gave back to God through Melchizedek the very best of what he had. And the apostle in Hebrews says that even the Levites paid tithes to Melchizedek. Who would have thought that? Verse 10, for yet he was in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him. And so Levi paid tithes to a greater high priest than that of Aaron and the high priest under the law. And so the conclusion was that the Levitical order was inferior to Melchizedek's and therefore required replacing. Verse 11, if therefore perfection were by the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need was there that another priest should arise after the order of Melchizedek and not to be called after the order of Aaron? And it's a rhetorical question. The superiority of Melchizedek was evident in the gifts that Abraham gave to him. Now, when we look at the section in chapter 5, I was getting a bit worried when Brother Stephen started dealing with Hebrews 5. But it's amazing, isn't it, how that brethren can go to the same section of Scripture and draw out of it quite different things and still come up with the same conclusions. But let's just read verses 1 to 4 for a moment. Every high priest taken from among men is ordained for men in things pertaining to God, that he may offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins, who can have compassion on the ignorant and on them that are out of the way, for that he himself also is compassed with infirmity. And by reason hereof he ought, as for the people, so for himself, to offer for sins. And no man taketh this honour unto himself, but he that is called of God, as was Aaron. And there are two qualifications which come out of this. The capacity for sympathy, that was one qualification, and the other one was, it was by divine invitation. They were appointed by God. And we want to look at this idea of divine intervention or divine invitation for a moment. You see, the apostle says that he was called of God. And that means to invite him into the priesthood. And we know that that was true because if we go back to Exodus chapter 28, we read there in Exodus 28 and verse 1, "Take thou unto thee Aaron thy brother, and his sons with him from among the children of Israel, that he may minister unto me in the priest's office. Even Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, Eleazar, Ithamar, Aaron's sons." And so they were invited. They were appointed by God by invitation. And that's what that word called means. It means to bid, to invite, to summon. And nobody else could occupy that position in the camp of Israel. If you look at Numbers chapter 18, we are told there that anybody who tried to violate that principle, they would die. Verse 7, "Therefore thou and thy sons with thee shall keep your priest's office for everything of the altar and within the veil, and ye shall serve. I have given your priest's office unto you as a service of gift. And the stranger that cometh nigh shall be put to death." And we recall in the days of Ezra, don't we? When they were coming back from the Babylonian captivity, there were a number in Ezra chapter 2 who said that they were priests. And they couldn't trace their genealogy, and therefore they weren't able to fulfill that responsibility. The law was very specific when it came to who occupied a priestly position. And anybody that tried to violate it would die. And again, we can recall King Uzziah. Uzziah had a second name, didn't he? Azariah. And somebody else had that same name, the high priest. And Uzziah went into the temple of God to offer incense under the Mosaic system. He wanted to be a king priest. And as soon as he did that, leprosy rose up in his forehead, and as he ran out, he came face to face with his namesake, Azariah. And Azariah had on his forehead holiness to Yahweh. And he became a leper, it says, until the day of his death. The other thing about the priests was the legislation that was given with regards to his physical condition. You go to Leviticus chapter 21, and we read there at verse 16, "Yahweh spake unto Moses, speak unto Aaron, saying, Whosoever he be of the seed of in their generation that hath any blemish, let him not approach to offer the bread of his God. For whatsoever man he be that hath a blemish, he shall not approach, a blind man, a lame, he that hath a flat nose, or anything superfluous, or a man that is broken-footed," and so on. And so there was an insistence upon physical perfection under the law. But sadly, there was no control over the moral conditions. And when we think about Nadab and Abihu, they fit the bill physically, or else they wouldn't have been allowed to engage in priestly work. But their moral values were anything but godly. They chose to offer strange fire before Yahweh. And certainly with Hophni and Phinehas, which we looked at earlier, these men were physically perfect, but they were anything but morally sound. And so the apostle tells us in chapter 7 and at verse 18, "For there is verily a disannulling of the commandment going before, for the weakness and unprofitableness thereof. For the law made nothing perfect, but the bringing in of a better hope did." And so the apostle Paul in Romans says, what the law was unable to do, and because it was weak through the flesh, God sending his Son in the likeness of sinful flesh, condemned sin in the flesh. The law was inadequate, and it had to be replaced. Jesus contradicted both these situations. His lineage and his physical appearance contradicted what was required under the law. You remember what it says in chapter 7 and verse 13. For he of whom these things are spoken pertaineth to another tribe, of which no man gave attendance at the altar. For it is evident that our Lord sprang out of Judah, of which tribe Moses spake nothing concerning priesthood. It's rather interesting that word sprang, it's the word Anatola. And when you go to the Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint version, you find that word Anatolia, it's the word branch in Jeremiah and other places. And so in making this statement, our Lord sprang out of Judah, he didn't say he was born in the tribe of Judah, he sprang out of it. The Spirit is directing us back to the idea that Jesus is linked with those Old Testament prophecies in the book of Jeremiah and the book of Zechariah. The prophecies are related to righteousness and peace. And so lineage was not important. God really wasn't interested in where you came from, but more interested in the principles that you live by. And so he says at verse 15, and it is yet far more evident that after the similitude of Melchizedek, there ariseth another priest. If anybody had a heritage, the Lord Jesus Christ did. He was born the Son of God. But this wasn't his qualification. It was obedience to the things of God. Verse 16 says, who is made not after the law of a carnal commandment, but after the power of an endless life. And I don't think, I can't quote this verse, and I'll probably quote it again before we've finished. But in chapter 5, and Brother Stephen drew our attention to this morning, verse 7, it says, who, talking about Christ, who in the days of his flesh, when he had offered up prayers and supplications with strong crying and tears unto him that was able to save him from death, and was heard in that he feared, though he were a son, yet learned he obedience by the things which he suffered. Here was a man that had a heritage different than anybody else. God was his son. Prophesied in the Old Testament, realized at the birth of Jesus in Mary. And yet, Jesus did never at any time play on that. But when we look at his physical appearance, well, yeah. I just comment on that qualification of righteousness. Two things come out of that. At the beginning of his ministry and at the conclusion of his ministry, Jesus was determined to uphold the righteousness of God. Thus it becometh us to fulfill all righteousness, he said. And of course, Paul says that he declared God's righteousness when he died on the cross. And like Aaron, he was called of God, verse 10 of chapter 5. But notice, if you checked out the Greek word in this case, it's different. It's I'm not even going to try and pronounce that one. It means to designate or to name. Rotherham says he was addressed by God as the high priest. So we find the Lord Jesus Christ called, but not in the same way that Aaron was called. Aaron was called, he was invited to become the high priest. Jesus was named the high priest because he was made perfect. That's what Paul says in verse 9 of chapter 5. Being made perfect, he became the author of eternal salvation unto all them that obey him. And his qualification was his obedience unto death. Even though he was a son, he submitted himself to the trials and the challenges of life and triumphed over them. And as a result, Paul says in chapter 7 and verse 15, he is made not after the law of a carnal commandment, but after the power of an endless life. The grave couldn't hold him. He was a man in history for the first time who had died and had done nothing worthy of death, because the wages of sin is death. And yet here was a man who'd done nothing to deserve death, apart from the fact that he bore our nature. He was under the constitution of sin. And because he was sinless, he couldn't stay in the grave. And God brought him forth after the power of an endless life. And when it came to his physical appearance, the record tells us, doesn't it, in Isaiah 52, that he had no form or comeliness. As many as were astonished at thee. Verse 14, his visage was so marred, more than any man, and his form more than any sons of men. And you remember when he said, before Abraham was, I am. And they said, you're not yet 50 years old. Well, he must have looked a lot older than what he really was, because the burden and responsibility that lay upon his shoulders weighed him down daily. And it says in chapter 53 and verse 2, he hath no form nor comeliness, and when we shall see him, there is no beauty that should desire him. He is despised and rejected of men. And so, from a biblical point of view, Jesus is presented as having no physical perfection. And yet, his perfection lay in his character, didn't it? Verse 26 of Hebrews chapter 7. For such an high priest became us, who is holy, harmless, and undefiled, separate from sinners, and made higher than the heavens. It tells us, doesn't it, in Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 15, we have not an high priest which cannot be touched with the feelings of our infirmities, but was in all points tempted and tried as we are, yet without sin. Here was a man that was sinless. And Jesus said to the Jews in John chapter 8, which of you convicteth me of sin? And they couldn't. They ignored the miracles. Men who touched lepers became unclean. Jesus touched lepers and they became clean. They couldn't deny the evidence. Which of you convicteth me of sin? His character was perfect. Sin had no control over his character. He was God's righteous servant, as Isaiah tells us. He was Yahweh, he who shall be, our righteousness. And what is required of us is faith in the Son of God. The law, the priesthood, the sacrifices, all inadequate in dealing with sin. Atonement was achieved not because of who he was, but because of what he was. The man made strong by God. In Psalm 110, we are reminded that Yahweh said unto my Lord, sit thou at my right hand until I make thine enemies thy footstool. And this idea of sitting at the right hand, it has a number of examples which show us what it really means. It's a matter of privilege. In Matthew chapter 25, those that were worthy were called to sit on his right hand, to be on his right hand. It's an association of power. When he stood before the high priest, and we'll look at this in a little while, it talks about him coming with power from the right hand of his Father. But it's associated with the firstborn, isn't it? And you remember, we'll not look at the verse, but in Genesis chapter 48, you'll remember when Joseph brought his two boys to be blessed by Jacob. Joseph strategically placed the firstborn, Manasseh, so that Jacob's right hand would go immediately upon him. And Jacob crossed his hands, didn't he? And he blessed Ephraim, the second born, and Joseph objected, but Jacob insisted, because the firstborn right was the son of the right hand. And when we look at the firstborn, the definition of the firstborn in Scripture, we can come up with quite a definition, because the firstborn maintains the family name. Deuteronomy chapter 21 says it's linked with inheritance. You remember Deuteronomy 21 is talking about the man who has two wives, and he doesn't like one of them, but her boy is the firstborn. And he said, just because you don't like her, you hate her, that doesn't mean to say that the firstborn will take second place. It was given precedent. It's identified with rulership and priesthood. And it involves separation and dedication. And it could be transferred. And you remember that Reuben slept with his father's concubine, and he lost his birthright. And it says in 1 Chronicles chapter 5 that birthright was given to Joseph, and so it could be transferred. When we look at Israel, Israel was God's firstborn. Israel is my son, we read in Exodus chapter 4 and verse 22. Israel is my son, my firstborn. Let my son go. And Israel bore the family name. We're told that in Deuteronomy chapter 28. He bore the family name. And Israel was destined to occupy a position of authority. Deuteronomy says that if you're faithful to me, you will be the head and not the tail. And you remember, if you go back to Deuteronomy 4, if we were doing 6 sessions, which we did many, many years ago on this subject, we'd be dealing with Israel in the kingdom. But you remember Deuteronomy 4, when God chose Israel, he set them in the midst of the nations. We're told in Deuteronomy 32, he was in the middle of the nations. And the purpose is given for us in Deuteronomy 4. He says that people will see how I've blessed you if you're faithful. And the nations will look and see what a great nation this is. And they will be drawn to you. That was Israel's role. They were to be the light of the world, and they failed. They were to be a dedicated people to God, separated unto him, holy. And they were called to be a kingdom of priests. And Israel lost its privilege of being firstborn, and it was given to somebody else. And 2 Samuel 7 tells us who that somebody else was. When thy days be fulfilled, and thou shalt sleep with thy fathers, I will raise up a seed unto you. I will be his father, and he shall be my son. And in Psalm 89, in that divine commentary regarding the Davidic covenant, we read there, he shall cry unto me, verse 26, thou art my Father, my God, the rock of my salvation. And God says, I will make him my firstborn, higher than the kings of the earth. And so Israel lost that privilege, and it was given to somebody else. And Jesus became the firstborn. He was born the Son of God. Sonship was not automatic, based upon what we read in chapter 10 of Hebrews chapter 10. It says there, then said I, lo, I come, in the volume of the book it is written of me, to do thy will, O God. And above, when he said, sacrifice and offering and burnt offerings and offerings for sin thou wouldest not, neither hadst pleasure therein, which are offered by the law, then said he, lo, I come to do thy will, O God. He taketh away the first, that he may establish the second. And so Jesus' sonship was not automatic. It was based upon his willingness, his commitment to the will of his heavenly Father. And that's true of us, isn't it, brethren and sisters? We might be baptized into Christ, but baptism doesn't guarantee us being in the kingdom. It certainly guarantees us being at the judgment seat. But the apostle says, if any man be in Christ, he is a new creature. And so baptism is supposed to set us on the path which changes us, so that we might reveal in ourselves the character of God. And Jesus did that. It was based upon his commitment to God's work. Let's just look at some of those passages. I always found these helpful, particularly when you're dealing with Trinitarians, because they point out that Jesus never claimed anything of himself. John chapter 4 and verse 34. Jesus says, my meat is to do the will of him that sent me, and to finish his work. In chapter 10, he says, at verse 17, therefore doth my Father love me, because I lay down my life that I might take it again. No man taketh it from me, but I lay it down of myself. And then he hung upon the cross, when he had totally given himself to the destruction of the flesh and the upholding of the righteousness of God. He said, it is finished. He completed the work of God. Sonship was based upon commitment. And Jesus was exalted because of his obedience to God. Look at Philippians, that second lovely verse to Hebrews chapter 5, verse 8. It's the servant passage, isn't it, of Isaiah? Behold my servant, mine elect. And he says at verse 7 that he made himself of no reputation. He took upon him the form of a servant, and was made in the likeness of men. And being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself, and became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. Wherefore God hath highly exalted him. And in that verse which our brother Stephen quoted this morning, it says in Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 3, who being the brightness of his glory, the express image of his person, and upholding all things by the word of his power, when he had purged our sins, sat down on the right hand of the Majesty on high. What a wonderful heritage we've got, brethren and sisters, of a man who emptied himself for the likes of you and me. And this resulted in Jesus becoming the firstborn, didn't it? It talks about it in Colossians chapter 1. He is the head of the body, the ecclesia, who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in all things he might have the preeminence. And so we could go on with all those others. And I support Brother Stephen in his interpretation of Psalm 2. His sonship was made possible by his resurrection. That seems to be the key to understanding that. Hebrews 1. For unto which of the angels said he at any time, Thou art my son, this day have I begotten thee, and again I will be unto him a father, he shall be unto me a son. Sonship of Jesus was made possible because when he died, he had done nothing worthy of death, and he was raised from the dead because the grave, says Peter, couldn't hold him. And as a result, he was exalted to the right hand of the Father after his resurrection. Hebrews 10. This man, after he had offered one sacrifice for sins forever, sat down on the right hand of God. You know, in the life of Jesus, during his ministry, we have a number of examples which sort of hint at that people understood his Melchizedek role. Let me just give you a couple of examples. We've got Luke chapter 1. And we know the situation in Luke chapter 1. It's all about the birth of John the Baptist and the circumstances surrounding it. And here's Zacharias in the temple. And he's told that he's going to have a child. And he doesn't quite believe it. And as a result of that, he's struck dumb. And you'll notice what it says about he and his wife. Verse 5, there was in the days of Herod, the king of Judea, a certain priest named Zacharias of the course of Abiah. And his wife was of the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. And they were both righteous before God, walking in all the commandments and ordinances of the Lord, blameless. And have you ever thought where you've read that before? Paul says, I'm a Hebrew of the Hebrews, of the tribe of Benjamin, of the Pharisees. I was blameless. He upheld the law. And so these two individuals were being presented to us as people who were impeccable under the law of Moses. And yet Zacharias has to learn that there's going to be a Savior, and that son that he was going to have was going to be the forerunner of that Savior. And John the Baptist discarded his priestly garments because he recognized that he could not achieve salvation under the law. and he submitted himself to Christ. But look what Mary said, what Elizabeth says. In verse 43, verse 42, and she spake out with a loud voice and said, Blessed art thou among women, talking to Mary, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb. And whence is this to me, that the mother of my Lord should come to me? There's Psalm 110, isn't it? And here's a woman who is of the line of Aaron, and all of a sudden, her and her husband realize that it's not going to be accomplished through the law. It's going to be accomplished through a man who their son was going to be the forerunner. And John the Baptist recognized that too, didn't he? In John chapter 1 and verse 27. This is a subject on its own, but we'll just touch on it. You remember when Jesus came to him? Verse 26. John answered, saying, I baptize with water, but there standeth one among you whom ye know not. He it is who, coming after me, is preferred before me. The shoes latchet, I am not worthy to unloose. Where did he get that from? Wasn't the Levite law, even though it's associated with it. But he got it from Melchizedek in Genesis 14, didn't he? That's what Abraham said, wasn't it? When Sodom, the king of Sodom, offered him his riches, he says that I will not take from a thread even to a shoe latchet, that I will not take anything that is thine, lest thou shouldest say, I have made Abraham rich. You see, the shoe latchet was, in the Levite law, it was removed if somebody was incapable of being the redeemer. And Boaz unloosed the shoe of the one who wouldn't raise up children to Naomi. And he took the shoe and became the redeemer. And John Baptist recognized that here was one that he couldn't unloose his shoe because he was the redeemer. And so we've got these little hints in the Gospels to the situation of Melchizedek. But I want us to look at one in detail, and that is in Matthew chapter 26. Just before we go there, and you don't need to turn to it, but in Matthew 22, 3 days before his crucifixion, Jesus is challenged by the Pharisees by quoting, and he responds by quoting Psalm 110, verse 42 of chapter 22. Jesus says, What think ye of Christ? Whose son is he? They said unto him, The son of David. He saith unto him, Well, how then did David in spirit call him Lord, saying, Yahweh said unto my Lord, Sit thou on my right hand, till I make thine enemies thy footstool. And it must have burned them, because they were speechless. They didn't dare give him an answer, because they knew that they were fallen into a trap, and it would expose them for what they really were. And so 3 days later, Jesus is now standing before the high priest. And in chapter 26 and verse 61, they found false witnesses, didn't they? To try and trap Jesus. One fellow said, Jesus said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days. And the high priest arose and said unto him, Answerest thou nothing? What is it which these witness against thee? And Jesus held his peace. And the high priest answered and said unto him, I adjure ye. He put him under oath. By the living God, that thou tellest whether thou be the Christ, the Son of God. And Jesus says, Thou hast said. Nevertheless I say unto you, hereafter you shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power, and coming in the clouds with power and great glory. Do you see the echo of Psalm 110? He says he was sitting, coming in power. Coming, Psalm 110 said he will send him from Zion. And the high priest rent his clothes and said he'd spoken blasphemy. Now, this isn't a parallel with Aaron's death. You remember in Numbers 20, Aaron went up the mountain and he divested himself of his garments. And they were placed upon Eleazar, and Eleazar became the new high priest. Well, when the high priest rent his clothes, he wasn't divesting himself like Aaron did in relinquishing his office. He was doing something which was prohibited under the law. The law said that if your high priest rends his garments, it was a penalty of death. Leviticus 10 and verse 6. Moses said unto Aaron, and unto Eleazar, and unto Ithamar his sons, uncover not your heads, neither rend your clothes, lest ye die, and lest wrath come upon all the people, but let your brethren, the whole house of Israel, bewail the mourning which the Lord hath kindled. And so to rend their clothes was a penalty of death. And in effect, the high priest is signaling his own death warrant. It's like the veil of the temple being rent when Jesus hung on the cross. It opened the way for the way into the most holy place. And Caiaphas is standing before the high priest elect, the Melchizedek priest, the son of the highest he is called. Jesus met every requirement of the law. He was the priest after the order of Melchizedek. And when he meets with his disciples, he offers bread and wine. He upholds God's righteousness on the cross. And somebody says, this was a righteous man. He becomes possessor of heaven and earth. All power is given to me in heaven and earth, it says in Matthew chapter 28. And he blesses his disciples. You see the parallel with Melchizedek, the parallel with David, and then he sits down at the right hand of God.